All jokes aside, today we're going to build a number 8 marquee. Let's get to it. The first thing is the face panel. That's basically the big flat piece of the marquee. I'm putting a piece of board on with clamps to create a router guide that my router will ride along with when I make my cuts. After that's finished, it's time to remove the big old holes that make up the 8. I don't know what the heck those are called, but I'm using the forstner bit to create a pilot hole that I'm going to route out later along these lines that I drew. After the holes have been bored out, again, I use a straight edge as a fence for my router. As you can see, I continuously move this fence around to make straight line cuts. Another hole has to be bored through the face so that I can make the cuts along the sides of the middle of the 8. For this, again, it's just a piece of wood along a straight edge so that the router can go ahead and knock this out. I went over this technique in a previous video, but right now we're going to be making the edges of the 8 by routing a groove through the centerpiece of a wood that happens to be 6 inches in width. I slide the edge wood into my groove jig, and obviously I'm gonna make some nice grooves in this thing, so check it out. Let this piece of wood right here be a fair warning against buying plywood from a department store. Yes. In this part, I'm going to create the center line so that I can create the light holes where I will bore out and put the lights in the actual marquee. I'm using my combination square to mark this line very simply here. It ends up being like 4.5 inches. This looks like I'm playing around, but what I'm trying to do is create the center dot by measuring from the left and right dots and eventually coming towards the center until I have the center. Now it's time to drill through the plywoods all the way through so you can see the hole from both sides. This is important. Use the forstner bit to on one side, but don't go all the way through. If you go all the way through, you get tear out. And that's why you had the pilot hole to begin with. You'll see why in a second. An easy way to know how deep you are in the actual wood is to look at the grain change. If you notice here, the grain in the hole and the grain on the face of the wood were at 2 different orientations. After the larger holes have been drilled, flip the number over and drill the small holes through the same pilot hole that you drilled before. Now it's time to cut and join edges, and as you can see, I'm using this high-tech painter stick. I use my combination square to transfer the mark. I'll give you a more detailed look at that in a second. The majority of the angles on the 8 will be 45 degrees, so that means the cuts have to be 22.5. You need to know the edge of the groove that sits inside the plank all the way to each of the edges of the plank as well. And so for me, that was 2 millimeters and 3 millimeters. I like to use the combination square when I have my actual measurement to score it so that when I take it to the table saw, it comes out nice and crisp. If you do it right, it should fit like a glove. If it doesn't fit tight to the edges, try again by recutting. I've been yelled at for not gluing, so make sure that you definitely apply glue before you apply any fasteners, aka brad nails. The surfaces of the next cuts are parallel to each other, so it looks a little weird. And you have to be mindful of that because you can't cut them all the same way. One of the cuts is a normal 22.5 like the rest, while the other one that sits right in the middle of that little V is a 45-degree cut. The measuring, transferring, scoring process, something that you will find yourself doing a lot. This last panel required that I have a face that was a little lower than the rest, basically on the same side as the groove. So what I had to do was route it out so that it could fit in and slide through the last piece while also maintaining the miter edges of the last slide. Take a look.